Right. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me all right? We've got a new setup now. We have Mary Lou over there with the doggies. Hello. And my iPad. And yep, there we go. Lawrence is early. Hello, Lawrence. Justin, Shell. Hi, how you doing? Nana's here. Oh, wonderful. Oh, two things at once? That's fine. I understand a lot of people listen and clean at the same time, so that's perfectly acceptable. So we are here to do, different gnome is here. Howdy, howdy, howdy. Oh, so sound is all right, I guess. I'm not getting a whole bunch of F's in the chat saying that sound is off, so that's good. For a while here, we had the sound reverberating until I put my headphones in on my iPad, and then it wouldn't do that crazy feedback loop. So we are here, and we are here to enjoy some Jordan Peterson. We are in the second half of the second video. Yeah, here we go. Make sure the volume's all the way up. All right. We're at...
If you read the writings of people like the kids who showed up to Columbine High School, they'll tell you exactly that that's precisely and exactly what they concluded and then acted out. So anyways, but in this, God says that it was good. And I thought about that a lot. It's like, because the question is something like, well, is something better than nothing?
F for the F of it. Hello, Shaman. Yes. So yeah, let me know if there's any problems with the sound. And we're at 105.12 free. That's enough. You can see the doggy cam over there. Mary Lou is eating with the dogs there, and so the dogs are after her cheese. So, all right. Let me just back this up a little bit. Or no, we'll just start from here.
Because that's a really good question, you know. And I thought about two things in relationship to that. And one is, well, maybe it depends on how it is that you are, right? Because it could be that there are ways of being in the world that justify the world. And there are ways of being in the world that make the world unbearable. And I believe that the narrative that runs through the biblical stories is precisely a dialogue between those two types of being. And the optimistic part of the story is that being requires limitation and suffering. There's no escape from that. But there are modes of being that allow that to be perhaps even more than tolerable. Perhaps there are modes of being that allow that to be good. And it's a straight and narrow road. It's a very difficult road to tread. So I think, well, that's possible. You know, I'm not an optimist by nature. But that's one of the things that I've conceptualized and read about that I actually find plausible, because it's certainly the case. Everyone knows this, that there are ways that you can act that make things worse. Everyone knows that. And so if that's the case, there has to be the opposite, right? There has to be ways that you could act that make things better. And obviously you can act in ways that make things really way worse. And so the question is, well, are there ways that you can act that make things really much better? And I think that's the question, is, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we have the being that requires limitation and suffering, and also simultaneously transcend that by our mode of being? And I believe that the biblical stories, and perhaps not only the biblical stories, but the biblical stories are one of the human imagination's best attempts to address and answer that question. That's what the entire story is about. So the first of it is the catastrophe of the collapse of self-consciousness and the entrance of humanity into history. And the rest of it is, okay, now we're in history. Now we know that we're going to die. We know about our mortality. We're conscious of our own being. Is there a mode of acting in the world that allows that to be justifiable, or maybe even more, that allows that to be triumphant? And then I would also say, maybe it's worth finding out, you know. That's the other thing that's so interesting, because you've got this short time on Earth, and there's lots of things that are very, very difficult to contend with. And you have the problem of tolerating yourself even in all your insufficiency. And one of the things that seems to me to be the case is that if you adopt a sufficiently profound mode of being, if you attempt to do that, then the mere act of lifting up that weight is enough to justify the fact that you're insufficient and mortal and bound by tragedy. And I believe that, and I believe people believe that, because if you watch how people act, they look for people they admire. And they do admire people, right? It's a natural phenomenon. You see it starting with children. Children admire and then they imitate. And we look to people who seem to be able to bear the burden of being in a heroic manner, and there's something inside of us that calls to that, and that makes us want to mimic that and to follow it. And I think that's the deepest and most profound of instincts, and I think it's right. And even if you're not so convinced on the positive end, because it's more difficult to be convinced of the positive, you can certainly be convinced on the negative end, because there are ways of being that are so brutal and so reprehensible that merely to read about them is enough to traumatize you. And I think that if you're a person who hasn't lost their soul completely, you can't help but encounter stories like that and shudder away from them. And,
that is a really, really good point. Showman says, F for fun and fabulous. F troop. Yes. So that was one of the things I was talking with Mantis earlier today about some of the stories that we've read and encountering bad guys in stories and narratives where we actually had to stop reading because the bad guy was so horrible that we just had to push away from that. And like one of the stories that Jordan Peterson has on his book list is this book called Ordinary Men. And it's about a village of German men during World War II who had volunteered. Oh, Floki's in the house. Hey, Floki. Floki the shipbuilder. That's awesome. These men were asked to be prison guards at the concentration camps, and they weren't Nazis. They weren't all in the ideology. They weren't SS troops. They weren't anything like that. They were just ordinary men from a village where they happened to have a work camp. And what happens through the course of this story, and it's a true story, is that these men at first are traumatized by what they have to do to the prisoners. They'll throw up afterwards when they go home. They won't be able to sleep. They'll have nightmares, things like that. But then slowly over time, they become used to the horrors that they're inflicting. And they turn from ordinary men into some of the most vicious torturers that you can think of. And I couldn't read the whole book. I could only read part of it because I could see where it was going. And it hurt my heart so much to know that human beings can be like that towards one another. I mean, it's absolutely horrifying. So, Sheila's in the house. Somebody was up all night with Greg, Rex, Hillbilly Taylor, and a few other people. So, yeah, I'm glad to hear that you did get some less rest, Lawrence. That's good. Free, there's no food left for you. Food's all done. I know you can smell it, but food's all done. So, yeah, there are two ways that we can be in the world. We can try and make the world better, or we can add to the suffering and all the evil and stuff like that, and we have a choice.
Yeah.
We have a choice. So
A lot of people don't want to go by it.
yeah, a lot of people don't want to. Yeah. So you can leave those dishes there and I'll get them later. You can just sit and relax. So
That's all I've done is relax.
Well, let's go back to watching Dr. Jordan Peterson here. So
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was the person who did most to unmask the absolute horrors of communist totalitarianism, said that he believed that the Nuremberg judgments were the most important event of the 20th century, and that was the judgment at the end of World War II, that there were certain actions that no one was to undertake, no matter what their cultural background was, because they were, let's say, crimes against humanity. That there was such a thing as universal evil. And you can debate that, you know, I mean, and people certainly have, but the problem is if you debate that, then you have to say that there are conditions under which the sorts of things that happen, say, in the concentration camps, which would be the gassing of children after their torture and their forcible removal from their parents and all the terrible things that went along with that, that's just okay. It's just an opinion. It's just something that happened, and there are circumstances under which that's justifiable. If there's no transcendent good and evil underneath that argument, it's only a matter of practicality. And it seems to me that that's not the right conclusion to draw. That's how it seems to me, and that's what Solzhenitsyn concluded when he looked at the Nuremberg trials. So the notion that it was good, well, even if you don't believe that, and you know, because maybe it's not as good as it could be, I would say it's incumbent on you as someone who participates in the process of furthering creation to act as if it could be good at least, and to further that with all of your efforts. Partly because what the hell else do you have to do that could possibly be better than that could possibly justify your existence more than that? And you know perfectly well, if you have any sense at all, if you think clearly about it at all, is that that's what you want to see in everyone else.
So everybody in the chat is saying hi to you, Mary Lou. So I was asking you to wave to them. So
Hi, everybody.
yeah. All right. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to interrupt.
You know, it's you're desperate and maybe you're cynical, and now and then someone appears that acts at least momentarily like a light in the darkness, and that lifts your spirit up and gives you a little bit of hope and maybe helps you continue on. Well, that's obviously a call to being. It's a statement from your own soul that says, well, there's something about that that's how you should be. And maybe then, well, we get a chance to participate in what is good. I've thought too, you know, well, we'll leave that for a little later. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kind, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. I like that. That's... You see, it's interesting, these old pictures, eh? Because if you look here, you got this halo around God's head, and you've got the split again between night and darkness, and God's right on the border between the two, and that's the sun, right? That's what a halo is. A halo is the sun or the moon. Sometimes it's like a coin. You know, you have the queen's head on the coin, and that's the queen on the moon, and it's silver, and it's a symbol of value because, of course, the queen is sovereign, and the moon is the sovereign of the night sky. And gold, of course, is the sun. And gold is pure because it doesn't mix with other metals, and it shines like the sun, so it partakes of the sun. And God partakes of the sun because there's something about whatever he represents that's associated with consciousness and illumination and enlightenment. It's that force of illumination and enlightenment that's right on the border between these two sets of phenomena. And that's kind of what that picture is trying to present. And so, you know, it's a metaphor. That's one way of thinking about it. But it does, again, allude to the underlying idea that there's something about consciousness that's integral to being itself. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. I mean, that's a remarkable bit of writing there too, because you just think about how bloody long it took our caveman ancestors to look at the night sky and start to figure out that there were repeating patterns across years that enabled them to mark the seasons. I mean,
I got to pause it for a second, folks. We're having doggy issues.
Oh, no, wait, here's some.
And we lost Mary Lou's camera, so I'm going to go plug it in and see if we can get it back. Oh, technical difficulties. One moment, please.
If you insist.
All right.
Can I do anything?
Oh no, ma'am. I think we just lost the battery.
Oh,
Yeah, the battery just died. I gotta do better about charging that next time. Oh, here we go. Now we just have to be careful of all the cords.
yeah.
All right, come on, Apple.
Did you know Helen Olsen at all?
No, ma'am.
What? Her mother, I think her mom and dad were separated. She lived with her mother and grandmother. And one sister was still there, but there was another one that was out. But they respected each other. It was so good to see. You know, they weren't angry with one another for doing something first or not doing it at all or all that crap.
Right.
But I think her mother and grandmother had a large part with that thing stopped. Right, here we go.
Sorry about that, folks. That's that feedback problem we were having earlier. Okay, now we've got Mary Lou's camera on, and it's muted, so we won't get that feedback now. Oh, my goodness. We're just having a party over here, so Shell says, hello, Mary Lou. Shaman says, hello, Mary Lou. Lauren says, hi, Mary Lou. Floki says, hello, Mary Lou. So everybody is saying hello to you.
Hello, everybody.
All right.
Wish I could memorize things, but I can't.
Oh, it's all right.
Right away.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. So you would remember everybody if you saw them on the screen.
Mm.
Yeah. You know, like for Lawrence's birthday party and stuff like that that we did. So, yeah. All right. Let's see what else Mr. Peterson has to say about the Garden of Eden.
Mm.
I just can't imagine how they figured that out. It's the degree of careful observation that it took. And I mean, we know people figured that out a long time ago because, those great megalithic monuments like Stonehenge seem to be astronomical observatories, essentially. And you see the same thing with the pyramids. I mean, people were looking at the damn sky, trying to figure out, looking at God, because that's kind of what you're doing when you're looking at the night sky, trying to figure out the regularity and order in the universe. And that's all compacted into this little light, and let them be for signs and for seasons to be oriented by the stars. Amazing. And then let them be lights in the expanse of heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night. And so there's an idea of sovereignty there too, right? That there's an analogy between the ruler and the heavenly bodies that light up the darkness, essentially. And that's a really interesting idea too, because it took us a long time to come to terms with, as I mentioned last week, to come to terms with the idea of sovereignty itself and to decide what constituted valid power. And it's not power. It's not power. It's authority and competence and not power. It's not dominance either. It's more sophisticated than that, because the people that you want to rule aren't people who have power, because power just means I can hurt you and you can't hurt me back. That's not what you need from a ruler, even though it devolves into that from time to time. What you want is the kind of wisdom that illuminates the darkness, and to associate the sovereign with the heavenly kings of the light is a perfectly reasonable thing to do from a metaphoric perspective. That's an ancient idea, and another example of how we're grounded in a dream. And God set them in the expanse of heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Another emphasis on the fact that it was better that there was something than nothing. And, maybe you could consider that the declaration of the cosmos is something like, well, it's better that there's something than nothing. And, well, how do you know that? And I guess the answer to that is that there's something instead of nothing. And I know that that's not proof, but But it's still a remarkable fact that it happens to be the case, and no one does know why that is. And so maybe we should go along with it and see what we can do with it, and see how we could make it better, because we certainly could if we were really committed to it, and we shook our resentment and our anger and our hatred. And I know there's reason for all of that, because people do suffer terribly, but God only knows what being could be like if we all contributed to it to the best of our ability. God only knows what we could conquer, and what sort of magnificent cities we could produce, and what things we could eradicate from the suffering of the world.
So that is a beautiful point that I love of his. Okay, Kevin Edwards, welcome. You're a new person. I haven't seen you before, but you're definitely welcome here. So howdy. So yeah, there's a big difference between authority and power. To have power over something, I can hurt you and you can't hurt me back, is not a relationship that we want. What we want is a relationship of authority, which is, I can hurt you, but I choose not to, because I respect you, even though you are lesser than me, and we can work together, and authority using wisdom, and we want that in our leaders. We want wisdom, not abuse. We want those in our spouses, especially as women. We want our husbands to be authorities and not just powers in our lives. In the relationship with our doggies, yeah, we want, them to respect our power, and we could easily crush them, but we don't, because we want that relationship. So we act as an authority, I'm in charge, treats all done. If you have more treats, you'll get fat. I know your ears perk up to that, but no. And yeah. And so they look to us, and they're able to be relaxed with us, because we're an authority, but we're not just power. So, okay. You're different now. You just changed your name, just rebranding. Gotcha. All right. I catch it now. So, Okie Kevin Edwards. Awesome. So yeah, and something rather than nothing, I think there is proof that something is better than nothing, because you can do something with something. You have options.
Right.
But when you have nothing, there's nothing you can do. Yeah. So, yeah, you're helpless. Absolutely. So, but, all right, let's go back to Jordan.
And there's this guy I read about. This is amazing, and I don't remember his name, but he found out about this worm that was called the guinea worm. And guinea worm is a really horrible thing, and you can look it up if you want, but I'll tell you a little bit about it, even though it's very distasteful. So a guinea worm is a parasite that lives in Africa, and it burrows under your skin, and it's quite long. It's about that long, and it's about that wide. And so it'll burrow underneath your leg, and then it's in there, and maybe it pokes its little head out a hole, which is one of its delightful tendencies. And then if you want to pull it out, it breaks, right? Because otherwise you just pull it out, you would be dead. And so it doesn't like that. So it just breaks off. And many people had this horrible disease, and well.
What's up, Free? No more treats. Sorry, the dogs are interrupting. You're okay. No more treats. Treats all done. Okay. So we'll go back to the guinea worm now.
You can't imagine what that would be like, because you're part of the 1% and you live in North America, and thank God for that. But just a little imagine, you don't even want to think about it, let alone have it. And he went to Africa and wiped the damn thing out. It's like, whoa, great. It seems to me the planet's a lot better off without any guinea worms on it. even though that's like guinea worm genocide talk, I'm still, pretty happy about it. And so that was one guy who thought, well, we don't need these things, and yeah, well, fair enough, and yeah, well, so good for him. Like, he can die thinking that the world's a better place than it was when he first popped out, and so good for that. I think that's a good aim. I think is to think that when you're on your deathbed, you can look back and think, well, there's a little less suffering in the world from here on out than there would be if I had never existed. And that's a lot better than the opposite, because it's certainly possible, say, if you're Stalin, to ensure that there's a hell of a lot more suffering in the world than there would have been if you hadn't lived. And we perfectly well know that people can manage that, and that many, many people try to do nothing but manage precisely that. So, and it's hard for me not to think about that as some sort of metaphysical evil, and I think it's the right way to look at it. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So you have the sun here, and then the moon here, as far as I can tell. Yeah. Actually, I think this is the moon over here, but so yeah, and that's part of the Sistine Chapel, which is an absolutely remarkable. No, part of the reason too, and part of the reason I'm teaching about these biblical stories is because, I'm thinking because the humanities have been decimated so badly, and again, I think that has mostly to do with resentment and hatred more than anything else. But I don't really think that you can get a grip on the humanities and what they have to offer without knowing the biblical stories, because they're the dream out of which the humanities emerge. And so, unless you have that background knowledge, that dream, then there's all sorts of things that are utterly profound that don't open themselves up to you. And Dante's Inferno would be one of those, and Milton's Paradise Lost, which is an absolutely amazing piece of work. I mean, Milton wrote it because he wanted to justify the ways of God to man. What an ambition that is. And I mean, he was serious about that. He took the problem seriously. It's like, it's the Mephistopheles problem, is that, well, this is a rough business that we're involved in. And, maybe we should just give it up. And I think the whole world, I think, was decided.
And more technical difficulties. The doggies are giving us a really, really hard time tonight, so I apologize for that. Oh my goodness. Heaven and hell right here in this room. All right, I'm going to move this cord over here, and that way the doggies won't trip over it. Oh, we're going to set this up again. Oh my goodness. There we are. There you are, your lovely face. All right, doggies. Here, you have this plate. Yep. All right, you have that. Oh my gosh. Thank you. Doggies want some camera time. Absolutely. They're getting very jealous. Oh, you want? You want this plate? Is that what you want? Yeah, plate's all done. Put it right there on the ground. Oh.
I didn't know you could open your mouth that wide. That sound.
You're okay, Sam. Yeah. Yeah. Lick the plate. You got the plate right there. Yeah. That's it. That's it. Oh my gosh. Chaos strikes again. Yes. There you go. There you go, Sam. Sam. Yeah, you have that. And then he just drops it right on the floor. Yeah. Food's all done. Food's all done. No more foods. No more foods. All right. We all done here? Sam, no growl. You want that bowl? Yeah.
There's no more there, just paper.
Yeah, just let them have the paper. There you go. All right. Now maybe they'll be, oh my gosh.
Talk about small children.
All right. Sam, all done.
You're too good a dog.
Yeah, as your good boy. Oh, Sam. Oh.
Oh, poor girl. Boy, what are you?
Right? No, all done. He still wants that. All done. All right, let me do Jordan Peterson, doggies. It's not one thing, it's another. I mean, oh my goodness. All right. Can you calm down a little bit? That's a no. Come here. Yeah. Food's all done. Food's all done. Go up and lay with Mary Lou.
In that in the 1980s, when we were deciding whether we were going to engage in the ultimate nuclear catastrophe, and we were very, very close to that a number of times. And I think it was a collective decision in some sense on the part of humanity that we might as well keep the whole awful game going rather than just demolish it. But Milton, he wrote Paradise Lost. It's a dream. Again, it's a dream. Trying to explain the nature of being and the nature of evil, and you can't crack the damn thing without knowing the underlying stories, and that's really too bad because it's utterly profound. And the reason you need profound things, as far as I can tell, you need profound knowledge is because life is actually a profound problem for everyone. I mean, you can shelter back and live a very conservative existence, and look, like, more power to you. I understand why you would do that, but it doesn't stop you from having to face the ultimate questions of life. Right? They're right there in everyone's face, and at least at some point in your life. And it would be better if you could, I think, if you could confront them full on and to deal with them properly and to be a beacon of strength as a consequence of that. And I think that wisdom, that's what the humanities are supposed to teach, is wisdom. And wisdom is what enables you to deal honorably with the tragedy of life. And I think I can't see how you could think that that was a bad idea, because there are going to be times when you're in an emergency room and prone to panic and to cry and to break down and to collapse and to be of no use to anyone around you. And that's not the right way to be. It's the right way to be in a situation like that is to be strong and reliable. And I don't think you can do that without being wise. And you can't be wise without putting yourself together, and without knowing something about where you came from and what you're like. And that's history and the humanities. And so this isn't optional. It's more necessary if man does not live by bread alone. And that's exactly the issue here. So you see these magnificent works, I mean, it's not like Michelangelo thought of this literally, he was a genius, for God's sake, and he's trying to get at something, and he's trying to get at the profundity of human culture. I suppose that's why you have this patriarchal figure here, and the cosmic role that consciousness and tradition plays in being itself, and it's ennobling. And you think people, religious or not, people, hundreds of millions of people come from all over the world to Rome and go through this little tiny chapel to look at this. There's something in it that everyone needs to see. It's not just beauty, it's more than beauty. It's that which feeds the soul. And everyone feels that, even if they can't explain it. So, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. Kind, right? That's kin, right? And to be kind is to treat others as if they're your kin. And so, according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. That's continually represented over and over. God said, that's the thing that calls being into existence, and God said it was good, and that's the fundamental judgment about the nature of reality. And one of the things that happens in the translation, in the movement, let's say, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, is God is obviously blessing creation in the beginning of this story. And then you have Old Testament God, and don't mess around with him, right? Because he'll give you a good smiting if you get out of line. There's no doubt about that. And he's kind of an arbitrary character. And, you know, lots of modern people think, well, how could you believe in a God like that? And it's like, when I read that, I think, well, the Old Testament people, that isn't how they thought. They thought, you better look the hell out because life is really difficult. And if you step out of line, you're going to get flattened. And God doesn't care, in some sense, whether you approve of him. It's like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? Obviously, you don't approve. It's like, you better pay attention, though, because otherwise you're going to be in real trouble. And that there's real wisdom in that. Nietzsche thought that Nietzsche really admired the Old Testament as a work of literature because he thought that the representation of the divine, let's say, as a representation of the essential nature of being was extraordinarily accurate in its arbitrary and often cruel nature. You know, it wasn't following a morality that human beings could really understand as moral. He thought that was very realistic, and I like that interpretation. But what happens in the New Testament is quite interesting because there's an insistence all of a sudden in the New Testament that you're supposed to act towards God as if he's nothing but good. And that's such a strange thing because you look at the world and you think, yeah, really, just good, eh? Well, the cancer and the earthquakes is kind of hard to fit into that picture, and you know, the terrible things that happen to children and all of that is very difficult to square with the notion of a good God, obviously.
Yes.
But then the underlying idea is that if you act in that manner, it makes it more likely to be true. It's something like that. And so I would consider that in some sense an act of both courage and faith. It's like you're going to make the case, like God makes at the beginning of the Bible, that being is in fact good. Now, you can't see it because, well, you get to see all the things about it that aren't so good. That's not the point. It's a metaphysical presupposition, something like that. It's a decision to act that way. I'm going to act as if being is good and to further that.
That was something that a friend of mine brought up. He used to be in the St. Louis Sheriff's Department. And, you know, so he saw some of the worst of humanity. He's dealing with crimes. He's dealing with domestic disputes. He's dealing with violence and all this other things. And he said, there are some things that I believe in, even though I know that they're not true. Because when I believe in them, they make me a better person. And that was, you know, he's like, I know intellectually it's not true. You know, people aren't inherently good. You know, there's a lot of evil that goes on in the world. But if you act as if they are inherently good, it makes our actions better. It makes our behavior better. Like I was up in Michigan with my family, and you know how family gets sometimes where they can just give you a look and it changes your whole mood.
Yeah.
Well, I ended up taking my contact lenses out so that I couldn't see their faces. They were all blurry. And so as a result of doing that, all I could do was go off their tone of voice and what they were saying. I wouldn't go off their expression, and it allowed me to treat them better and be happier and nicer, you know, so that they wouldn't trigger me. And so, there's some things that it may be obvious that things are bad, that there is evil in the world and all this other stuff, but we can't act like there is.
Right,
Yeah.
my father had a good handle on handling me and explaining what was going on. I wasn't that old. And it soon helped because every once in a while there was something he would say that made it believable and would happen or would not happen. And he and his mother were very close. And I asked him once, you know, how did that happen? Because I know he loved his father. But his father died and he had his mother to look after. And she was a very stubborn, high active person, and she didn't want any help. Well, first he yelled at her, and then he kind of settled down, and they talked. And it took a while, but they got so they liked and loved each other.
Yeah.
I was wondering what my grandmother would, I don't know what to say. She was always so nice with all the grandchildren. She wouldn't agree with them all the time, but they knew that she loved them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's,
So she, she was 91, I think, when she died.
wow.
She had, I think it was 8 children. I've lost track now. But she loved them all, and she didn't like it when there was something they didn't do, and she let them know, but not yelling over top of them. She got them to talk to her.
Yeah.
And I said to her once, I don't know how long after that, I said, Grandma, how did you get so used to talking to your children and having them listen and understand what you're saying? He said it was just something she did, and it wasn't a planned, but she loved her children. She wanted them to have a good life too.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you understand that, when you can feel that, coming from your grandmother,
Yeah.
you get that automatic respect. And so, yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah,
That's
both my
beautiful.
grandmothers, of course, Henrietta Finch, and what the heck was grandma? Oh shoot. Now I've lost it all. I lost my
It's okay.
Oh.
It's okay.
She was a hard worker. I think my grandfather died fairly early, and there were still, I think there were 3 younger than my mother. Now about the same that were older than her. But she was nice with the kids, and not that they were really kids then, but she would talk to them, and sometimes she would just say, let's talk about that later if we want to, not that let's do it.
Right. Right.
And they all loved her like crazy.
Yeah.
I asked her once, I said, Grandma, how did you work that out like that? She said that she didn't. It was all of them. And I thought, oh,
That's nice.
yeah.
That's nice. So,
Yeah, because I thought she could do nothing wrong. Well, I didn't think Grandma Finch could do anything wrong either, but she was the tiniest woman I ever saw, I think.
yeah.
And she would talk to you, and if she didn't like something you said, she would let you know, but not in a nasty, get out of here voice.
Right.
She
Right.
would try to understand why you felt that way.
Yeah.
She was good, and her family was all from New York. And by the sounds of things I heard, I think they were very well off.
Ah.
And when they had her come visit, she was the top one then. And I know she loved that. I mean, she loved her children and all of them. There wasn't one that didn't love their mother.
Oh,
It was,
that's
I asked my
fantastic.
father, he was the youngest, I said, how could you go through life and not get angry? He said, because I loved her.
There you go. There you go.
You know?
And it's through love
Yeah.
that we can overlook. And that's why it's, so important for us to look at the good in life,
Yeah.
is so that we can overcome all the negativity.
Yeah.
So, and that's why, and going back to Jordan Peterson, the God of the New Testament, we have to think of God as good,
Yeah.
because that will get us over all of everything else. So,
Yeah, I think that's true.
yeah. Well, thank you. All right, let's go back. We'll watch a little bit more.
And then the implicit idea is, well, there isn't any way that you can make things work out better than to do that. And so there's a courageous element to it, which I think is also expressed to some degree in the idea of Christ's voluntary sacrifice of his own life. His presupposition was something like, I'm going to act as if God is good, and I'm going to play that out right to the end. And now that becomes something like a divine pattern. And I believe there's wisdom in that, because, again, most of the time that I've been wrestling with this sort of thing, I've always been looking at the opposite. I haven't been studying good, I've been studying evil. Because evil is easier to believe, especially after the 20th century. It's like, I think you have to be blind not to think about the things that happened in the 20th century as evil. And some of the things that happened were so brutal, it's just absolutely unimaginable. And, well, unless you imagine it. And it's right there. It's part of the historical record. And then I think, well, if there's something that's that terrible, it indicates as clearly as anything can that there's also something that's its opposite, and that's whatever it is that's the farthest away possible from that outcome. Now, that doesn't mean we can exactly say what it is, because it's easier to grip, in some sense, what it means to torture and break and hurt, and not to be able to conceptualize so clearly how you would have to act if you were acting in the exact opposite manner. But at least it implies that it exists, and I see that pattern being laid out in this dreamlike manner in the New Testament, and it has something to do with, well, it has something to do, and this is for sure, with the voluntary acceptance of mortality. Because, of course, that's the poisoned apple, right? The fact that everybody looks forward into the future to know that you're finite, and so is everything that you love. And it's very difficult for that not to poison your existence. And, well, there's no getting out of it, as far as we can tell, but there might be something like switching your attitude to it, and you could say, well, that's the price you pay for being. And the heroic thing to do is to accept that, and not even to accept it grudgingly, to say, all right, I'm going to go along with that, I'm going to accept that, and I'm going to act nonetheless as if being is good, and then I'm going to see how things turn out. It's something like that. And God saw that it was good. And so it's an act of courage, right? There's an act of courage that's associated with that transformation of attitude. And even with regards to the notion that the world is good, it's a courageous attitude, especially given that there's so much evidence that makes that conclusion difficult to continually draw. But the alternative seems to me to be far worse. So there's God again with the sun behind him, because he's associated with the solar consciousnness, and he's creating all these strange, wonderful creatures. And you know, and people say, well, you know, the idea of God as an old man in the sky, let's say, that's primitive. It's much more better to think about it as a much more better, Jesus. Anyways, it's more sophisticated to think of the divine essence as a disembodied spirit or something like that. But you know, that's not so obvious either, because as I already pointed out, there isn't anything that's more complicated than a human being. And so the idea that the divine is something that's at least as complicated as a human being strikes me as something that's actually quite reasonable. And I know it's a metaphor, although I don't know to what degree it is a metaphor, and it's also something that's embodied. And that's also a very interesting notion, you know, because it's become increasingly obvious as we tried to do such things as produce artificial intelligence, that it's very difficult to produce an intelligence or perhaps a consciousness that isn't embodied in some manner. It can't be just a spirit without form. And I think that's part of the reason too why Christianity puts so much emphasis at the end of time on the resurrection of the body, because there's a drive in there to ennoble the idea of the body, not just the spirit, the consciousness that floats abstractly above the body, but to say that no, you can't do that. You can't just shed that part of you that's heavy and material, so to speak, and leave it behind as if it's of no value. You have to ennoble that as well, and that idea is also linked to the representation of God as a human being, and as a wise human being, and as something that's embodied. And so, at least from the metaphorical perspective, I don't think it's reasonable just to brush your hands across it and say, well, that's primitive, because I don't think it is. I don't think it's primitive at all. And then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And it's our, because, well, this is part of the priestly story. There's, as I said, a number of sources for the Old Testament. And in the priestly version, if I remember correctly, it's Elohim. That may be wrong. It doesn't matter, but
he's right.
Precisely, it doesn't matter, because the notion is that the God who's in the background of this story has a kind of plurality of being, right? And it looks like the idea of monotheism arose with great difficulty across time, because there are lots of powers, and the idea that there's a power of powers was something that it wasn't easy for people to figure out, because what's constant across sources of power? Well, some kind of meta power, but it's hard to figure out what that is, and that's what's being represented by the movement, as far as I can tell, from polytheism to monotheism.
Well, he's absolutely right that it was Elohim. He did remember that correctly, even though he doesn't have it in front of him. And some of the translations, like with the other biblical studies that I've done, is that he was talking to the angels, because the Jews had the idea of powers and principalities. Like there was an angel over each city. And so when he says, let's make them in our image, it's not just the image of God, but the image of angels as well. So that's where the whole translation of Elohim comes from. So he did remember that, right?
It's the observation that there are powers that determine the destiny of people, at least in part, that you're subject to. And then the idea that there's something common across all those powers that you can represent, partly, say, with the idea of the sun rising in the morning and fighting its way out of the darkness at night, and that's associated with consciousness and sovereignty. It's very, very... See, one of the things that bothers me about simple-minded atheism, and I would say that simple-minded atheism is of the sort that regards these stories as nothing but simple superstitions, is that it's very, very poorly informed. Because whatever these stories are, they're not merely simple superstitions. They weren't conjured up by some cabal of priests to bamboozle the masses, even though they were used for that purposes from time to time. It's much, much more complicated than that. They have a very ancient lineage, and they're tied together with all sorts of other stories. And there's an emergent wisdom in them. And I think the right way to view them is as the birthplace of sophisticated philosophical ideas. And so you have to wrestle with these stories. You can't just... And I said already that I'm going to be as rational as I possibly can in my discussion of these stories, and not refer to anything metaphysical except when that's absolutely necessary, even though I don't want to eliminate the possibility of a metaphysical reality, because I think that's premature. But you have to take the story seriously if you're going to approach the problem properly. You can't just casually dismiss them. It's not appropriate. And so let us make man in our image. That's a very interesting idea. And like I said, it's not easy to understand how it was that human beings came up with the idea that us lowly creatures were... So with the Mesopotamians, for example, and the Greeks were like this too. Human beings weren't godlike. They were the playthings of the gods, right? They were just... The gods just tortured us for their amusement, love and hatred and anger and all those powerful forces. We were just playthings to the gods. There wasn't anything particularly divine about us. The notion that in some sense we partake of the divine that's a staggering idea. And you don't want to underestimate the difficulty that there was in abstracting that, or the utility of that idea for our current mode of being. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That's interesting because there is more than one creation story in Genesis. And in this story, males and females are basically created at the same time. Later, Eve is extracted out of Adam, and we'll talk about that, but not here. It's the two sexes are generated simultaneously, and they both carry within them the divine stamp, which is very egalitarian and very appropriate, and I think unbelievably advanced. That's what it looks like to me. And God blessed them. Well, that's a good thing. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And there's God creating Adam and Eve, and they're looking pretty happy about the whole thing. And that's Michelangelo's famous Sistine Chapel representation. There's some cool things about this. I mean, you got to wonder, this is an aside, and I don't know if it's a credible aside, but it's an interesting aside. So that's a form of credible. What the hell is God doing in this thing? I mean, what is this exactly? And so there's been some interesting answers to that, and this is one of them. So there was a group of scientists about 20 years ago that remarked on the precise analogy between this structure and the brain bisected down the middle. And of course, Michelangelo was one of the first people who did detailed dissections, and so they felt that Michelangelo had put God inside the brain for some reason, and that seems to me to be associated with the notion that there's an analogy or a metaphorical identity between the notion of whatever God is and the structures that give rise to consciousness. And I think we really underestimate the degree to which consciousness is both, say, miraculous and not understood. I mean, you have what appears to be an entirely material substrate, yet here you are, aware and self-aware and able to generate the world merely in some sense by looking at it. It really is remarkable, and that consciousness is dependent on something that wells up from deep within that material substrate that we don't understand at all. It's really a crazily remarkable thing, and you hear a lot about scientific reductionism, but I'll tell you something that's kind of interesting, and it's a tangent too. The guy that discovered DNA, I think it was Watson, and it's Watson and Crick, but I don't remember who wrote this book, but one of them, I don't remember which one, he believed that DNA was so complicated that it had to come from space. He didn't believe it could have possibly evolved on Earth. And so, like a lot of these people who are used as exemplars of scientific reductionism aren't like that at all when you actually read what they had to say, right? They were very aware of the limits of their own knowledge. And I mean, DNA is something really quite spectacularly remarkable. It's an eternal substance. It's been around for a very long time. And the idea that we understand it is a very stupid idea. And I would say that the same thing applies to the brain. Like we're scratching away at the surface of something we don't understand at all. And so it's quite interesting, I think, that, and maybe Michelangelo had enough gall to do that. It's certainly possible. I mean, he had enough gall to do dissections when the cost of that was death. He had to rob corpses essentially to go and do it. So he wasn't, I would say, not particularly politically correct. So, so that's kind of interesting. And there's another representation of the same thing. And that's a funny one. I had to throw that in. I don't know how many of you know this, but there's this joke in the atheist community. I think it might have been started by Richard Dawkins, but that might be wrong. That it was just as reasonable to believe in the flying spaghetti monster as it was to believe in God. And that's the flying spaghetti monster, by the way. And so that's called "Touched by His Noodly Appendage." And anyways, it's fun. It's not very sophisticated, but it is funny. So. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. I like that too, I did a lot of counseling work with people who were coaching work, I guess, with people who were fairly spectacularly successful, and they were usually workaholics. They're the sort of people that were like, they'd work 80 hours a week, just nonstop. That's just what they were like. And one of the things we were always trying to figure out was, well, how much should you work? Because one answer is you just work till you die, right? I mean, you just exhaust yourself. And, well, that's not a good idea. And then you have to figure out why that isn't a good idea. It's got to be something like this, is that you don't want to do so much work that the amount of work you do interferes with the amount of work that you could still do, right? Because if you work like mad for 2 weeks and then you have to lie in a hospital bed for a month, that obviously isn't very productive. So you have to figure out how much you can work diligently, and then how much you have to recuperate so that you can get back up and work again. And that's, people have basically settled on something like this and given it the divine imprimatur. That's one way of thinking about it, which is, well, you can toil away for 6 days, and no wonder, because you have to work, but you should rest at least 1 day out of 7, because otherwise, well, you don't appreciate life. That might be part of it. And plus, I think it's more a matter of iterability, because one of the things that defines morality is the capacity to repeat something, right? So if something is properly structured in a moral manner, then you can do it over and over and over again without any degeneration. And so that's kind of like a relationship. If your relationship is negotiated, you can continue to negotiate it, and then you can have a relationship that lasts for a long time. You can do it today and next week and next month and next year. You can maintain it across time. And this, I would say, is the wisdom that's being garnered over God only knows what period of time, to say, well, look, I mean, even God needed to take a break and appreciate what was going on. It's not such a bad thing for people to follow that pattern. And that's a good thing for modern people to know, because we seem to be, even though, we're very wealthy by historical standards, our capacity to relax isn't exactly what it could be. And I think that's really hard on people.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go over again the idea of the attributes of God. I talked about that a little bit last week, but I want to return to it, because I think it's worth dwelling on a little bit, because we're trying to figure out what it is that people were trying to formulate when they were formulating these representations. And we've sort of come to the conclusion that there's an attempt to abstract out the nature of power from specific aspects of power, and there's some attempt to associate that with consciousness as that which gives rise to being itself, and there's some attempt to associate that consciousness with something that has a cosmic quality, whatever that might mean, and it's a statement that it has a cosmic quality rather than a discovery. It's a mere statement that there's something about consciousness that has world-generating significance, and also the implication that it's associated with human beings as well. It's a very interesting set of propositions, and I don't believe that they're simply refutable. Like it's a perfectly coherent argument, even though it's primarily made metaphorically. And so then, once again, I want to build up the framework of associations around the idea of God. One of the things that Freud did when he was interpreting dreams, and this is quite useful, so if someone comes to me with a dream, then I have them tell me the whole dream, and then I get them to repeat it line by line, and then whenever they say a line and there's an object in it or a person or something like that, I ask them what that makes them remember, or what that thing means to them, or what comes to mind. And that's the associational technique, and it's predicated on the idea that your memory works by association. And you know that if you're daydreaming, you go from one thing to another like a conversation does, and that you can take an idea that's at the center of a web of associations, and by tracking the associations, you can kind of zero in on what the idea might mean. And then Jung expanded that by trying to, he called it to amplify the dream by thinking about narrative or literary or mythological similarities that might be associated with the narrative structure of the dream. And I think often that can be unbelievably useful, And it's like the dream is an idea that's trying to come to birth. It's partly formulated, and then if you discuss it and amplify it, it's like you can speed along its transformation into a more articulated idea. And the dream is also something that, because your mind is trying to, with one foot in the unknown, it's trying to formulate what's out there in the unknown and to make it concrete. But it doesn't do that in one fell swoop. It doesn't just take potential and turn it into articulated ideas. It has to dream up what's out there first, projects its imagination out there to get a handle on what it might be. And then that's presented in the dream, and if you analyze the dream, you can make it more articulate. And so that's what we're going to do with the attributes of God, to build up the representational structure a little bit. So the hypothesis is that God is an abstracted ideal, formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or ruler. And the underlying idea there too is that when the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt. And the biblical Egypt is a tyranny. And so there's a very, very solid idea in the Old Testament that I think took people, God only knows how long, to figure out that if you transformed if you confuse the notion of sovereignty with the current sovereign, then your culture immediately degenerated into a totalitarian state and turned to stone. And that was deadly. Then you were slaves. And then the thing was going to collapse as well. Like, no matter how big and grandiose, as soon as the ruler became the concrete incarnation of the ideal, there was no distinction between the man and the divine notion of the ideal, then the society was doomed. And I think that's true. It's as simple as that. And I think we saw more than enough evidence of that in the 20th century, and we're certainly seeing the same thing repeating itself now. When the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt, and the biblical Egypt is the archetypal tyranny. So,
and that's happening right now. If you've watched the Real Greg Kelly show, he showed that clip where people are starting to confuse the idea of the sovereign, our president, with God. And you can't do that, because the ideal is the ideal, and people are inherently flawed. And so if you meld the two things, you've made the ideal flawed, and therefore that can justify all sorts of awful things, because like the Pharaoh was not only king but God. And what wrong could he, if he made a mistake, if he did something wrong, that was sanctified, that was considered okay. And so you become a slave, you become a victim, you become that which can't fight back. So, and it's kind of scary that that's repeating even today. Yeah.
Even more so scary, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Even more so scary. So,
so what is God like? Well, from the Christian perspective, there's three elements. One seems to have something to do with tradition. And so that's God the Father. And that's partly the embodiment, I would say, of the human being, and that's an ancient thing. And it's also partly the embodiment of the tradition of human beings, which is also a very ancient thing. And that's the structure, as I said. It's the structure that consciousness emerges from, that enables us to grapple with the unknown as such. And then there's the intermediary between that and Christ, say, that's the Holy Spirit, that's that bird. And that's the Spirit in a more abstracted sense. And I would say that's probably as close as Christianity ever got to the notion of consciousness as such, disembodied consciousness, something like that. And then there's the notion of the suffering individual, and that's a very complicated idea. And it's something like, so there's this idea, an old idea, and I believe this was originally a Jewish idea, that something with the attributes of God, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, lacks something. So it's like a Zen cone. It's a really interesting idea, because, well, what in the world can something like that lack? And the idea is limitation. So yes. Something that's everything lacks limitation. And that's that idea, like when I first encountered that, just blew me away. I thought it was such a brilliant realization that there are advantages to not being able to do things. Partly because it gives you something to do. I suppose that's a big part of it, right? It's if you had everything you wanted at every moment at your fingertips, well, there's nothing, there's no story. It's funny, because that happened to Superman, the cartoon character. By the 1980s, he could juggle planets, and you could bounce like hydrogen bombs off him and it'd be fine. It's like everyone got bored because, well, what were we going to do to Superman? It's like you lob a hydrogen bomb at him and he just brushes it off and like combs his hair, and that's the end of that. And the whole cartoon series basically died because he didn't have any flaws. There's no story without the limitation. And I think that's an absolutely remarkable idea. And so part of the notion of Christ, and this is something that I puzzled over for a long time, and I learned a lot of this from Jung, is that there's idea in Christianity that there's consciousness as such, which which in some sense is eternal. It stretches from the beginning of the time to the end of time, but it's this abstracted notion. But it lacks a certain kind of reality because it's not instantiated somewhere. It's not instantiated in a specific time and place in history. And so the idea of the Son, the third part of the Trinity, or one of the three parts of the Trinity, is the notion that tradition and consciousness as such also has to be embedded in history in a particular time and place. And so there's the archetypal embeddedness, and that would be the incarnation, and that's the perfect man, right, who accepts his mortality and acts in a virtuous manner. But it's the archetypal story of every individual as well. And there's a very strong strain in Christianity. I would say this is more pronounced in Orthodox Christianity, that the proper path of life is to take the tradition, let's say, and the spirit that's associated with consciousness as such, and to act it out in your life, in your own personal life, in a manner that's analogous to the manner in which Christ acted it out in his life. And what that means in part is the acceptance of the tragic preconditions of existence. And so that's partly betrayal, right? Betrayal by friends and by family and by the state. And it's partly punishment for sins that you did not commit, as well as the ones you did commit. And sometimes that's just a relief. But, the arbitrary nature of justice. And also the fact of finitude. And the notion is that your duty, let's say, and the way to set things right in the cosmos is to accept that as a necessary precondition for being and to act virtuously despite that. And that's a very, very powerful idea as far as I'm concerned. And I'm also, the world's a weird place, and I've seen some very strange things in my life. And one of the things that I've seen is that, I've dealt with some people who are very, let's say, they weren't on a good path. Let's put it that way. And one of the things that was really interesting about being around people like that, it was almost like they were surrounded by a gravitational field of sorts. I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously. And their worldview was so warped and twisted that if you came within contact of them, you all of a sudden started to play a part in their drama. And it was almost inevitable. They would maneuver and manipulate and interpret in a way that made you into the villain in their story, no matter what it was that you wanted to do. And unless you've encountered something like that, and many of you probably have, you don't know how powerful a pull that is. And so it's certainly possible that someone can act in like a gravitational object and bend things around them to fit their narrative, their unhappy and tragic narrative. But I've seen the opposite too, where people who were aiming upward with the best of their ability, and because of that, they had a positive effect on the people around them, and that ordered things around them in profound ways. And I think it's an open question, the degree to which the cosmos would order itself around you properly if you got yourself together as much as you could get yourself together. We know that things can go very, very badly wrong if you do things very badly wrong. There's no doubt about that. But the converse is also true. If you start to sort yourself out properly, and then you have a beneficial effect on your family, first of all, that's going to echo down the generations, but it also spreads out into the community. And we are networked together. We're not associated linearly. We all affect each other. And so it's an open question, the degree to which acting out the notion the notion that being is good, and the notion that you can accept its limitations and that you should still strive for virtue. It's an open question how profound effect that would have on the structure of reality if you really chose to act it out. And I've seen things, as I said, in my life that indicate that I do believe there's a metaphysical element to life as well as the rational, practical element. And I think there are times when those two things come together, and I've seen that happen. And so I don't think we know the limits of virtue. I don't think we know what true virtue could bring about if we aimed at it carefully and practically. And so the notion that there's something divine about the individual who accepts the conditions of existence and still strives for the good, I think that's an idea that's very much worth paying attention to. And I think the fact that people have considered that idea for at least 2,000 years quite seriously is also an indication that there's at least something to be thought about in relationship to that. So that's kind of the Trinitarian idea. Same idea there. And you see, it's interesting too, because you have God the Father, essentially, who's coming out of this strange, see, this isn't the sky exactly, and you see this very often in these old pictures. It's not exactly the sky, whatever the heaven was that people believed in. It's something it's like the sky opens and there's a dimension beyond the sky. It's something like that. And I wanted to show you this too, just to show you that this isn't only a Western conception, and it has something to do with mystical experience, because there's a bodhisattva. It kind of looks like he has a hat, but that's not a hat. That's a whole bunch of bodhisattvas going back to eternity, right? And this hole in the sky here is like a hole into time, and these things are recurring across time. It's the eternal recurrence of this redemptive archetype, and the sky opens up, and you can see that thing recurring and recurring and recurring. Same idea is basically, that's the blue Buddha, who's a healing entity sitting in a mandala, which is like a representation of paradise. And it's the same idea. It's like reality opens up and reveals this image of perfection. And so it's a universal conception, and I think it's a representation of the possibility of the metaphysical and the physical coming together in some sort of communication. It's something like that, anyways. And I mean, you have to remember that there's absolutely no doubt that people have metaphysical and religious experiences. That's an absolute fact. You can induce them chemically. You can induce them electrochemically. Lots of people who have epilepsy have epileptic prodromas that are associated with divine enlightenment. So Dostoevsky, for example, he had epilepsy, and that was really, I think, one of the things that made him a great author, and Dostoevsky would have this feeling that he was going to have an epileptic seizure, and he said that the feeling for him was that the world was opening up and he was becoming more and more and more enlightened, and he was just on the verge of grasping the essence of existence, and then he'd have an epileptic seizure. And for the subjective feeling was that much knowledge was just too much for him to bear. Well, you can say, well, that was a neurological abnormality, and fine, but God, he was Dostoevsky, and so you can't just brush that off. So, so that's the Trinitarian idea fundamentally, and this notion here is the notion that, well, the cross is a funny thing, because the cross marks the center, and it's an X, and the X is the center of the world, like the X that the cathedral is, and it's the center of the world is where you are, because as a consciousness, you're the center of the world, and that center of the world is a place of betrayal and suffering and limitation. That's exactly what it is. And the question is, well, given that, and given the fact that you know it, what the hell are you supposed to do about it? And what that representation, I believe that's Goya, what that representation implies is that you're supposed to voluntarily accept that and then move forward.
Forthrighteously.
Well, in good faith and with courage, that's the notion, and that you're supported. You're supported by your tradition, and that's why you need your tradition too. That's why you need to be embedded in your tradition, because without the support, let's say, of your father, and I mean that both practically and metaphysically, without that behind you, without the knowledge of you as both a biological and a cultural creature, without that depth of knowledge, you don't have the courage to do it, because you don't know what you are, what you could be. And so without that, because you're a historical creature, what students ask me sometimes, why study history? It's like, well, because history is about you. That's why. It's like history tells you who you are. You can't tell who you are because you only live a little while. How the hell can you figure out who you are? So you need all this collected wisdom and all this dream-like information and all this mythology and all this narrative to inform you about what you are beyond what you see of yourself. And you're pummeled down and people picked on you, and there's 50 things about you that are horrible, and you've got a self-esteem problem, you're sort of hunched over, and you've got all these problems, and so it's not easy to see, let's say, the divinity that lurks behind that, unless you're aware of the heroic stories of the past and the metaphysics of consciousness, let's say. I don't think that you can have the courage to regard yourself as the sort of creature that can stand up underneath that intense existential burden and move forward in courage and grace. And of course, that's part of the reason that I'm talking about these biblical stories. And it's 9:30, so we're going to have to stop.
All right, so that concludes the second video in the series. So we're only at 6:19. We can start the third video if you're interested. Yeah? Okay, let's start the third video then. All right, let's go to the series here. Go up. 2 out of 7. Can we just, there we go.
I'm really looking forward to this lecture, not like I wasn't looking forward to the other ones, but the stories that I want to cover tonight, one of the things that just absolutely staggers me about them, especially the story of Cain and Able, which I hope to get to.
Yes.
Like, it's so short, it's unbelievable. It's like 10, 11 lines. There's nothing to it at all. And I've found that it's essentially inexhaustible in its capacity to reveal meaning. And I don't exactly know what to make of that. I mean, I think, because I said I was going to take as rational an approach to this issue as I possibly could. I think it has something to do with this intense process of condensation across very long periods of time. That's the simplest explanation. But I'll tell you, the information in there is so densely packed that it really is, it's not that easy to come up with an explanation for that. Not one that I find fully compelling. I mean, I do think that the really old stories, and we've been covering the really archaic stories in the Bible so far, I think that one of the things that you can be virtually certain about is that everything about them that was memorable was remembered, right? And so in some sense, and this is kind of like the idea of Richard Dawkins' ideas of memes, which is often why I thought that Richard Dawkins, he was a little bit more mystically inclined. He would have become Carl Jung, because there are theories that are unbelievably similar. The similar of meme and the idea of archetype of the collective unconscious are very, very similar ideas, except the Jungian idea is far more profound in my estimation. Well, it just is. It's just, he thought it through so much better, because Dawkins tended to think of meme as sort of like a mind worm, something that would infest the mind and maybe multiple minds. But he never really I don't think he really ever took the idea with the seriousness it deserved. And I did hear him actually make a joke with Sam Harris the last time they talked about the fact that there was some possibility that the production of memes, say religious memes, could alter evolutionary history, and they both avoided that topic instantly. They had a big laugh about it and then decided they weren't going to go down that road, and so that was quite interesting to me. But the density of these stories, I do really think still is a mystery. It certainly has something to do with their impossibility to be forgotten. And that's actually something that could be tested empirically. I don't know if anybody has ever done that, because you could tell naive people 2 stories even equal length, right? One that had an archetypal theme and the other that didn't, and then wait 3 months and see which ones people remembered better. It'd be a relatively straightforward thing to test. I haven't tested it, but maybe I will at some point. But anyways, that's all to say that I'm very excited about this lecture, because I get an opportunity to go over the story of Adam and Eve and the story of Cain and Abel, and I hope we manage both of those today, and maybe we'll get to the story of Noah and the Tower of Babel as well, but I wouldn't count on it.
Right.
Not at the rate we've been progressing, but that's okay. That's no problem. There's no sense rushing this. All right, so we're going to go. Before we do that, I want to finish my discussion of the idea of the psychological significance of the idea of God, and I've been thinking about this a lot more. Because, of course, this lecture series gives me the opportunity and the necessity to continue to think. And, it certainly is the case. So the hypothesis that I've been developing with the Trinitarian idea is something like that the Trinitarian idea is the earliest emergence in image of the idea that there has to be an underlying cognitive structure that gives rise to consciousness, as well as consciousness itself. And so what I would suggest was that the idea of God the Father is something akin to the idea of the a priori structure that gives rise to consciousness. That's an inbuilt part of us, so that's our structure. You could think about that as something that's been produced over a vast evolutionary time span. And I don't think that's completely out of keeping with the ideas that are laid forth in Genesis 1, at least if you think about them from a metaphorical perspective. And it's hard to read them literally, because I don't know what, there's an emphasis on day and night, but the idea of day and night as 24-hour diurnal, daytime and nighttime interchanges that are based on the earthly clock seems to be a bit absurd when you first start to think about the construction of the cosmos. So just doesn't seem to me that a literal interpretation is appropriate. And, I mean, it's another thing that you might not know, but many of the early church fathers, one of them, Origen in particular, stated very clearly, this was in 300 AD, that these ancient stories were to be taken as wise metaphors and not to be taken literally. Like the idea that the people who established Christianity, for example, were all the sorts of people who were biblical literalists is just absolutely historically wrong. I mean, some of them were, and some of them still are. That's not the point. Many of them weren't, and it's not like people who lived 2,000 years ago were stupid by any stretch of the imagination. And so they were perfectly capable of understanding what constituted something approximating a metaphor, and also knew that fiction, in some sense, considered as an abstraction, could tell you truths that nonfiction wasn't able to get at, unless you think that fiction is only for entertainment. And I think that's a big mistake to think that. So, all right, so here we go. So, yes, so with regards to the idea of God the Father, so the idea is that in order to make sense out of the world, you have to have an a priori cognitive structure. And that was something that Immanuel Kant, as I said last time, put forward as an argument against the idea that all of the information that we acquire during our lifetime is a consequence of incoming sense data. And the reason that Kant objected to that, and he was absolutely right about this, is that you can't make sense of sense data without an a priori structure. You can't extract from sense data the structure that enables you to make sense of sense data. It's not possible. And that's really been demonstrated, I would say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, since the 1960s. And the best demonstration of that was actually the initial failure of artificial intelligence. Because when the AI people started promising that we would have fully functional and autonomous robots and artificial intelligence back in the 1960s, what they didn't understand and what stalled them terribly until about the early 1990s was that it was almost that the problem of perception was a much deeper problem than anybody ever recognized. Because like when you look out at the world, you just see, well, look, there's objects out there. And by the way, you don't see objects, you see tools. Just so you know, in neurobiology, that's quite clear. You don't see objects and infer utility. You see useful things and infer object. So it's actually the reverse of what people generally think. But the point is that regardless of whether you see objects or useful things, when you look at the world, you just see it and you think, well, seeing is easy because there the things are, and all you have to do is turn your head and they appear. And that's just so wrong that it's almost impossible to overstate. Like the problem of perception is staggeringly difficult. And one of the primary reasons that we still don't really have autonomous robots, although we're a lot closer to it than we were in the 1960s, is because it turned out that you actually have to have a body. You have to have a body before you can think. And even more importantly, you have to have a body before you can see, because the act of seeing is actually the act of mapping the patterns of the world onto the patterns of the body. It's not things are out there, you see them, then you think about them, then you evaluate them, then you decide to act on them, and then you act. I mean, that you could call that a folk idea of psychological processing or perception. It's not. That is not how it works. Like your eyes, for example, one of the things they do is map right onto your spinal cord, for example. They might right onto your emotional system. So it's actually possible, for example, for people to be blind and still be able to detect facial expressions, which is to say for someone who's cortically blind, so they've had their visual cortex destroyed often by a stroke, they'll tell you that they can't see anything, but they can guess which hand you put up if you ask them to. And if you flash them pictures of angry or fearful faces, they show skin conductance responses to the more emotion-laden faces. And it's because, imagine that the world is made out of patterns, which it is, then imagine that those patterns are transmitted to you electromagnetically, through light, and then imagine that the pattern is duplicated on the retina, and then that pattern is propagated along the optic nerve, and then the pattern is distributed throughout your brain, and some of that pattern makes up what you call conscious vision, but other parts of it just activate your body. And so, for example, when I look at this, whatever it is, bottle, that's the word. When I look at it, especially with intent in mind, as soon as I look at it, the pattern of the bottle activates the gripping mechanism of my hand, and part of the action of the act of perception is to adjust my bodily posture, including my hand grip, to be of the optimal size to pick that up. And it's not that I see the bottle and then think about how to move my hand. That's too slow. It's that I use my motor cortex to perceive the bottle, and that's actually somewhat independent of actually seeing the bottle as a conscious experience. So anyways, the reason that I'm telling you that all of that, and there's much more about that can be told. Rodney Brooks, he's someone to know about. He's a robotics engineer who worked in the 1990s, and he invented the Roomba, among many other things. He's a real genius, that guy. And Brooks was one of the first people to really point out that to be able to have a machine that perceived well enough to work in the world, that you had to give it a body, and that the perception would actually be built from the body up rather than from the abstract cognitive perceptions down. And so, well, that turned out to be the case. And Brooks built all sorts of weird little machines in the 1990s that didn't even really have any central brain, but they could do things like run away from light. And so they could perceive light, but their perception was the act of running away from light. And so perception is very, very, very tightly tied to action in ways that people don't normally perceive. Anyways, yes. That's all to say that you cannot perceive the world without being embodied. And, you're embodied in a manner that's taken you roughly 3.5 billion years to pull off, right? There's been a lot of death as a prerequisite to the embodied form that you take. And so it's taken all that trial and error to produce something like you that can interact with the complexity of the world well enough to last the relatively paltry 80 or so years that you can last. And so I think about that as, and this may be wrong, but I think it's a useful hypothesis. I think the idea of God the Father is something like the birth of the idea that there has to be an internal structure that out of which consciousness itself arises that gives form to things. And well, and if that's the case, and perhaps it's not, but if it's the case, it's certainly a reflection of the kind of factual truth that I've been describing now. And then, like I also mentioned, that I kind of see the idea of both the Holy Spirit and also of Christ, and most specifically of Christ in the form of the Word, as the active consciousness that structure produces and uses, not only to formulate the world, because we formulate the world, at least the world that we experience, we formulate, but also to change and modify that world, because there's absolutely no doubt that we do that, partly with our bodies, which are optimally evolved to do that, which is why we have hands, unlike dolphins that have very large brains like us, but can't really change the world. We're really adapted and evolved to change the world, and our speech is really an extension of our ability to use our hands. So the speech systems that we use are, very well-developed motor, very well-developed motor skill. And generally speaking, your dominant linguistic hemisphere is the same as your dominant hand. And people talk with their hands, like me, as you may have noticed. And we use sign language, and there's a tight relationship between the use of the hand and the use of language. And that's partly because language is a productive force, and the hand is part of what changes the world. And so all those things are tied together in a very, very complex way with this a priori structure and also with the embodied structure. And I also think that's part of the reason why classical Christianity puts such an emphasis not only on the divinity of the spirit, but also on the divinity of the body, which is a hard thing to grapple with. It's easier for people to think, if you think in religious terms at all, that you have some sort of transcendent spirit that's somehow detached from the body that might have some life after death, something like that. But the Christianity in particular really insists on the divinity of the body. So the idea is that there's an underlying structure that's got this quasi-patriarchal nature, partly because it's, for complex reasons, but partly because it's a reflection of the social structure as well as other things. And then that uses consciousness in the form particularly of language, but most particularly in the form of truthful language in order to produce the world in a manner that's good. And I think that's a walloping, powerful, powerful idea, especially the relationship between the idea that it's truthful speech that gives rise to the good, because that's a really fundamental moral claim. And I think that's a tough one to beat, man, because one of the things I've really noticed is, and it isn't just me, that's for sure, is that there's a lot of tragedy in life. There's no doubt about that. And lots of people that I see, for example, in my clinical practice are laid low by the tragedy of life. But I also see very, very frequently that people get tangled up in deceit, in webs of deceit that are often multiple generations long. And that just takes them out, and so deceit can produce extraordinary levels of suffering that last for very, very long periods of time. And that's really a clinical truism, because Freud, of course, identified one of the problems that contributed to the suffering we might associate with mental illness with repression, which is kind of like a lie of omission. That's a perfectly reasonable way to think about it. And Jung stated straight out that there was no difference between the psychotherapeutic, the curative psychotherapeutic effort and supreme moral effort, including truth. Those were the same thing as far as he was concerned. And Carl Rogers, another great clinician who was at one point a Christian missionary before he became more strictly scientific, he believed that it was in truthful dialogue that clinical transformation took place. And and of course, one of the prerequisites for genuine transformation in the clinical setting is that the therapist tells the truth and the client tells the truth, because otherwise, how in the world do you know what's going on? How can you solve a problem when you don't even know what the problem is? And you don't know what the problem is unless the person tells you the truth. That's something really to think about in light of your own relationships, because if you don't tell the people around you the truth, then they don't know who you are. And maybe that's a good thing, because, seriously, people have reasons to lie, right? I mean, that aren't trivial. But it's really worth knowing that you can't even get your hands on the problem unless you formulate it truthfully. And if you can't get your hands on the problem, the probability that you're going to solve it is just so low. And so then I've been thinking about as well, this idea has become more credible to me the longer I've developed it, the longer I've thought about it. The idea that there's, I'll go back. It's partly the idea that, let me figure out how to start this properly. Friend of mine, business partner, and a guy that I've written scientific papers with, very smart guy, took me to task, and I think I told you this a little bit, about using the term dominance hierarchy, which might be fine for like chimpanzees and for lobsters and for creatures like that, but not for chimpanzees even so much. And he said something very interesting. He thought that the idea of dominance hierarchy was actually a projection of a early 20th century quasi-Marxist hypothesis onto the animal kingdom that was being observed. And the notion that the hierarchical structure that you see that characterizes, say, mating hierarchies in chimps, for example, the idea that that was predicated on power was actually a projection of a kind of political ideology. And I thought, that really bugged me for a long time when he said that, because I'd really been used to using the term dominance hierarchy, and I thought, he told me all that, I thought, that's so annoying. It's so annoying, because it might be right. And it took me months to think about it. And then I was also reading Franz de Waal at the same time, and he's a primatologist, and also Jack Panksepp, who's a brilliant affective neuroscientist who unfortunately just died. He wrote a great book called Affective Neuroscience, and for rats to play, they have to play fair, or they won't play with each other. That's a staggering discovery, right? Because anything that helps instantiate the emergence of ethical behavior in animals, and that associates it with an evolutionary process, which is essentially what Panksepp was doing, gives credence to the notion that the ethics that guide us are not mere sociological epiphenomenoal constructs. They're deeply rooted. If rats, and they're rats for God's sake, you can't trust them, and they still play fair, And
so I need to go back about 3 minutes in this, because he was talking about how, dishonesty can have generational effect, and you and I both know this from alcoholism in our families. And, it's like for my grandparents, my mother's parents, whenever her father was drunk, he was sick. And so my mother swore at a certain age, I think she was a teenager, when she decided that she would never, ever be sick. And that sickness was something to be avoided at all costs. And that became a big problem when I got sick with my chronic illness. She had a hard time even being around me, because that was something she had avoided her whole life. And it was almost based on a lie. He wasn't sick, he was drunk, And so she had a really hard time being able to it wasn't until I got much, much better and much more stable that she was even able to be around me. Because sickness was so awful for her, and it wasn't something, because it was a lie that was wrapped around alcoholism. It was embedded with shame, and it was embedded with resentment and things like that. And those emotions have nothing to do with real biological sickness. Those have to do with alcoholism. And so she had a very, very hard time, coming to terms with me, and still even to this day has a hard time hearing when I'm not doing well. It frightens her because she has no control over it. And it brings up all those childhood emotions about, her family and her father in particular being sick. So.
Yeah, my mother's family has kind of similar problems with a couple.
Yeah. You may want to speak up. I don't know if they can hear you.
My mother was, I believe, like the middle of 5 children, and there were always problems between them, and there were always problems about alcohol.
Yep.
And it really hurt them all.
Yeah. Yeah.
After a while, they stopped even talking to one another. And at first I wasn't going to say anything to any of them, and I thought, I have to. I can't let it go. Let them try to work it out. It won't be the same for them, but maybe they'll have some dignity.
Right.
All of them were fairly smart, so it wasn't because they didn't know things or couldn't learn anything.
Right.
It was too sad to see let go.
Yeah.
I know that sounds crazy, but it did. I don't know if it really struck them for long or not. I could never tell when they were telling the truth or if they were embroidering it.
Right.
I talked to my mother about it, and I don't think she was completely honest either. She grew up with the hurt of it from her brothers, and didn't have a sister, I don't think, but from her brothers. They were sometimes not nice at all with my grandmother. In fact, one of them hit her.
Oh, no.
And that ended it for them.
Oh, no.
I don't know. I mean, they probably most of the time were halfway drunk.
Yep. Oh, this is John checking on you.
Hey.
Just checking in on you.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I should have called you to say it was going to take longer than I thought. But
we're live on YouTube right now, John.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, no worries. I'm just checking in on you. For some reason, your watch was showing you were over on Collier Street.
Oh.
Must not have updated.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, that's it. Hello to everyone in YouTube land.
John says hello to everybody in YouTube land. they all say hello to you.
yeah.
All right. See you later.
Okay. All right. Bye. Yep.
He's probably upset.
Well, if your watch says that you're in the wrong place, of course he's going to worry.
Yeah. Probably down.
Yeah. So yeah, John is her son, and she's got. You want to show them your watch? You want to hold that up? She's got this.
It's upside down now.
Yeah. But she's got this watch that lets him know where she is, so that she never gets lost. So.
Because I've done that before.
Yeah.
Been lost.
Yeah. So Okie Kevin Edwards says, Man, even Mary Lou has one of those watches. I should get one. So, yeah, yeah. And it's amazing that alcoholism has that much of an impact, where it's not just the alcoholic that lies, but everyone around them starts lying too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a lot of problems with alcohol, probably 2 generations before I was born,
Right.
if not more.
Yeah, these things go on for generations and generations, and it just, it impacts the parents, which impacts the children, which impacts the grandchildren, and
You can't get away from it if you're there. I mean,
yeah,
you can be honest about it, but sometimes it makes it worse, and
right.
other times it helps. How do you know?
Yeah, and it's really hard to know.
Yeah.
So, Lawrence asks, who is John? John is her son. So that's Mary Lou's son, and they're right next door. So yeah, he just checks in on her every once in a while. If she's got one of those GPS trackers, and for some reason it showed her like several streets down, so he didn't realize that she was at my house. So yeah.
Yeah, he worries about me all the time. And I said, I've gone past the worst part. I said, I can pretty well take care of myself, and I have a couple of friends that are a big help.
Yeah. But he's still gonna worry,
Yeah.
he his heart would break if something bad happened to you.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Instead of if something happened to him.
Right. So Okie Kevin Edwards says alcohol was the drug of choice for thousands of years. Yeah, I would say tens of thousands of years. It's one of the oldest drugs that we've put into our bodies.
I don't know. I don't think I was in school yet, but we're seeing some of my relatives totally drunk, couldn't be steady on their feet.
Yep. It's embarrassing. Yeah. It's hard. So
These are the relatives that wouldn't touch their drink for
their whole lives. Yeah, because of it.
Right.
I mean, just didn't want any part to do with it. So yeah, it's understandable. So, but Jordan Peterson then went on the track, talking about how even rats play fair, and the idea of our morals are not just because we're thinking, talking creatures. Our morals, I mean, the dogs even, if you're not playing fair with them, they'll stop playing. They just, so animals have a sense of right and wrong and fairness. And so it's not something that's just uniquely human.
I thought that was the best point.
Right?
I don't know how old I was when I stopped, but I always put myself down because the kids were teasing so.
Yeah.
And first it started out, I would cry, and finally my mother talked to me and said, if you can stop crying, they will not bother you half as much.
Right.
And when you need help, you have someone with me.
Good. Yeah.
And she's right, because she was special.
Yeah.
She had gone through it herself, really, with her father.
Uh-huh.
How my grandmother put up with him, I'll never know, but it happened.
Right. So, yeah. We get through.
Yeah.
We get through somehow. So, all right, we got about 11 minutes left. Let's do a little bit more of Peterson. See if he gets to a good stopping place.
And the wall, noticed that the chimp troops that he studied, it wasn't the barbaric chimp that ruled with an iron fist that was the successful ruler, because he kept getting torn to shreds by the compatriots that he ignored and stomped on. As soon as he showed some weakness, they just tear him into pieces. The chimp leaders that were stable, that had a stable kingdom, let's say, were very reciprocal in terms of their interactions with their friends. And chimps have friends, and they actually last for a very long time, chimp friendships. And they were also very reciprocal interactions with the females and with the infants. And I thought Franz de Waal is a very smart guy. And I thought that was also foundational science, because it's really something to note that the attributes that give rise to dominance in a male dominance hierarchy, sort of use that word, let's call it authority, that might be better, or even shudder competence, which I think is a better way of thinking about it, is that that's not predicated purely on anything that's as simple as brute power. And I think too, I think as well that the idea, and this is a deeply devious and dangerous political idea in my estimation, the idea that male hierarchies are fundamentally predicated on power in a law-abiding society, I think all you have to do is think about that for like a month, say, which isn't that long, to understand how absurd that is, because most people who are in positions of authority, let's say, are just as hemmed in by ethical responsibility, or even more so, than people at the other levels of the hierarchy. And we know this even in the managerial literature, because we know, generally speaking, that managers are more stressed by their subordinates than the subordinates are stressed by their managers. And that's not surprising. You want to be responsible for like 200 people? You really want that? That's hard work, man. And I mean, I know it's a pain to have a boss, because you have to care about what the boss thinks. And maybe the person is arbitrary, in which case they're not going to be particularly successful. But it's no joke to be responsible for 200 people. And you have to behave very carefully when you're in a position of responsibility and authority like that, because you will get called out if you make mistakes constantly. Yeah. So it's not like because you have a position that's higher up in the hierarchy that you're less constrained by ethical necessity. Now, if you're a psychopath, well, that's a whole different story. But psychopaths have to move pretty rapidly from hierarchy to hierarchy, right? Because they get found out quite quickly. And as soon as their reputation is shattered, then they can't get away with their shenanigans anymore. So, okay, so all of this is to say that there is something very interesting about the pattern of behavior. So imagine that sexual selection is working something like this. And we know that sexual selection is a very, 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 very powerful biological force, even though biologists ignored it for almost 100 years after Charles Darwin originally wrote about it, thinking mostly about natural selection. They didn't like the idea of sexual selection because it tended to introduce the notion of mind into the process of evolution, because it deals with choice. But so imagine on the one hand that you have a male hierarchy. We know that the men at the top of the hierarchy are much more likely to be reproductively successful than the men at the bottom. And it's particularly true of men. So you have twice as many female ancestors as you have male ancestors. I'm not going to do the math, and I know it doesn't sound plausible, but you can look it up and figure it out. It's a perfectly reasonable fact that actually happens to be true. So you have twice as many female ancestors, because females are twice as likely on average to leave offspring as men. Now what happens is any man who does reproduce tends to reproduce more than once, but a bunch of them reproduce zero. Whereas, so it would be the average man who reproduces has 2 children, and the average man who doesn't reproduce has 0, obviously, and the average woman who reproduces has 1 child. So that means that there's twice as many females in your line as there is males. So that's a big deal. And so imagine that it works something like this. So the men elect the competent men who are admired and who are I can't say dominant, who are given positions of authority and respect. Let's put it that way. And it's like an election. Now, it could be an actual democratic election, but it's at least an election of consensus, or it's at least an election of, well, we're not going to kill him for now, which is also a form of election, right? It's a form of tolerance, So, and then what happens is the women, for their part, peel from the top of the male hierarchy. And so you've got 2 factors that are driving human sexual selection across vast stretches of evolutionary time. One is the election of men by men to positions where they're much more likely to reproduce. And the second is the tendency of women to peel off the top of male dominance hierarchies, which is extraordinarily well established cross-culturally. Even if you flatten out the socioeconomic disparity, say, between men and women, like they've done in Scandinavia, you don't reduce the tendency of women to peel off the top of the male hierarchy by much. And why would you? I mean, women are smart. Why in the world wouldn't they go for why wouldn't they strive to make relationships with men who are relatively successful? And why wouldn't they let the men themselves define how that constitutes success? It makes sense. Like if you want to figure out who the best man is, why not let the men compete and let the man who wins, whatever the competition is the best man by definition. How else would you define it? So, okay, so why am I telling you all that? Well, the reason is because it seems to me that there's been this complex interplay across human evolution between the election of the male dominance hierarchy and sexual success. And that's a big deal if it's true. It could be, because what would happen, you see, is that as men evolved, they would evolve to be better and better at climbing up the male hierarchy, because the ones who weren't good at that wouldn't reproduce. So obviously that's going to happen. But then it wouldn't just be a hierarchy, because there's a whole bunch of different hierarchies. And so then you might say, well, are there commonalities across hierarchies? That's a reasonable thing to propose. I mean, they're not completely opposed to one another, at least. If you're relatively more successful in one hierarchy, then it's more probable that you'll be successful in another. And that's actually a really good definition of general intelligence, or IQ. And that's actually one of the things that women select men for. Now, men also select women for that, but the selection pressure is even higher from women to men. And general IQ is one of the things that propels you up across dominance hierarchies, because it's a general problem-solving mechanism. And the other thing that seems to do that to some degree is conscientiousness. And there's also some evidence that women prefer conscientious men. So, and of course, why wouldn't they? Because you can trust them, and they work. And so those are both good things. So then you think, okay, so men have adapted to start to climb the male dominance hierarchy, but it's the set of all possible hierarchies that they're adapted to climb. And so then you think there's a set of attributes that can be acted out, that can be embodied, that will increase the probability that you're going to rise to the top of any given hierarchy. And then you could say, well, then as you adapt to that fact, then you start to develop an understanding of what that pattern constitutes. And so that starts to become the abstract representation of something like multidimensional competence. And that's like the abstraction of virtue itself. Well, and none of that's arbitrary, man. That's as bloody well grounded in biology as anything could be. And I think that's a really hard argument to refute. And like one of the things I should tell you about how I think is that when I think something, I spend a long time trying to figure out if it's wrong, because I like to hack at it from every possible direction to see if it's a weak idea, because if it's a weak idea, then I'd rather just dispense with it and find something better. And I've had a real hard time trying to figure out what's wrong with that idea. It seems to me that it's pretty damn solid. And then the idea that, if you watch what people do in movies and so on, and when they're reading fiction, it's obvious that they're very good at identifying both the hero and the anti-hero. We could say the anti-hero, generally speaking, the bad guy, is someone who strives for authority and position, but fails. Generally speaking, not always, but fails. So he's a good, bad example. You take a kid to a good guy, bad guy movie, the kid figures out pretty fast that he's not supposed to be the bad guy. And figures out very quickly to zero in on the good guy. And that means that there's an affinity between the pattern of good guy that's being played out in the fiction and the perceptual capacity of the child. And one of the things I told my son when he was a kid, when I used to take him to movies that were sometimes more frightening than they should have been, but one of the things I always told him was, I never said don't be afraid, because I think that's bad advice for kids. What I said was keep your eye on the hero, right?
Yes.
Keep your eye on the hero. And he was gripped by the movie and often quite afraid of them, because movies can be very frightening. So he just zero in on that guy and hoping, and you know what it's like in a movie, you hope that the good guy wins, generally speaking. And I mean, why do you do that? Where does that come from? You see how deeply rooted that is inside you. You'll bloody well go line up and pay to watch that happen. It's not an easy thing to understand. And it's so self-evident to people that we don't even notice that it's a tremendous mystery. And so is it so unreasonable to think that we would have actually, over the millennia, come to some sort of collective conclusion about what the best of the best guys are, best of the good guys are, and what the worst of the bad guys are? And to me, archetypally speaking, thinking of that as the hostile brothers, so that's Christ and Satan, or Cain and Able, for example, very common mythological motif, the hostile brothers. It's like those are archetypes. It's like the Satan, for example, is by definition the worst that a person can be. And Christ, by definition, this is independent of anything but conceptualization, is by definition the best that a man can be. Now, as I said, I'm speaking psychologically and conceptually, but given our capacity for imagination and our ability to engage in fiction, and our love for fiction, and our capacity to dramatize, and our love for the stories of heroism and catastrophe and good and evil, I can't see how it could be any other way. So that's part of the idea that's driving the notion of the evolution of the idea of God, and even more specifically, driving the evolution of the idea, at least in part, of the Trinity.
So we will stop it there. And so just to summarize, we all have this notion of what the best man is. And, evolutionarily, we've been driving towards that. The best men have the most opportune mating, they have the best opportunities for their kids. And so over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we've selected for the best of the best of the best of the best. And we have that idea of the hero and what would be a perfect man, embodied in the idea of Christ. And then even higher than that, that's where we have our conception of God, the greatest good. God is the greatest good. So, I'm going to look in the chat here real quick. People are talking about dreams. Oh, yeah, the pink tutu one, that was amusing. So, look at Sam. He's being so cute with Mary Lou over here. And then she's got Free on the other side. So
She's just enjoying herself there.
Yeah. Shaman says, have you read Extreme Ownership? That is an excellent book. I have that book, or I had that book at one point. And it's the idea of always taking responsibility. Even if you didn't cause the problem or anything like that, you say, I'll take care of it. And it's a wonderful book. And that's one of the ways to go up that hierarchy is to be more competent.
Right.
Whatever the problem is, I'll take care of it. And so, that's a great book for guys. If anybody, if anybody wants to check that out. So, Survival says, I could write that book. Yeah. You actually have that attitude, Survival, of, it doesn't matter what it is, you'll jump in there and take care of things. So, and it's very fitting that your name is Survival, and Survival never goes out of style, your old username. So, but anyway, we're a few minutes over time. The dogs have finally settled down, and I will try and fix the technical problems, but it's so cute to be able to see Mary Lou there and both the dogs on the couch. I know that it's difficult to see here, but you're pretty far back in the frame, but you get everybody in the frame as a result. So, yeah.
She's just enjoying her blanket.
Yeah, just enjoying her blanket. And, maybe I need to get a mic for you. I don't know if people were able to hear her very well. But if not, I'll get a little lapel mic for you that you can wear. So Survival says, tell Mary Lou that I said goodnight and that I love her. So you got fans on here.
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Now I have a good head.
So, all right. I'm sorry for running over, guys. I just needed to get to a good stopping point with Jordan, and then also to talk to you guys. So, Shaman says, yes, tell Mary Lou good night. So we are going to wave good night now.
Good night.
So, good night. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.